The precise weight of the pen in my hand, the cool, smooth glide of its nib across the vellum, was a familiar comfort. Each contour line I laid down was a whisper of the earth's ancient memory, meticulously rendered, a testament to order in a chaotic world. My life, until recently, had been a series of such careful calibrations, the exact angle of a declination, the subtle shift in elevation across a forgotten valley, the precise script for a centuries-old parish boundary. I was Reid, and maps were my language, my solace, my truth. Then came the letter, thick with the scent of mildew and forgotten lineage, bearing news of an inheritance. A remote, ancestral estate, nestled deep within a peninsula's forgotten reach. My great-aunt, a woman I barely remembered, had passed, leaving behind a property described by the solicitor as extensive, if somewhat rustic. Rustic, I would soon learn, was a euphemism for a slow, dignified decay. My arrival was heralded by the crunch of tires on an overgrown gravel path, a sound swallowed almost immediately by the dense, murmuring woods that pressed in on all sides. The house itself loomed, a silhouette of gables and chimneys against a bruised twilight sky. Stone, weathered to the color of old bone, sagged under the weight of centuries. Windows, like vacant eyes, stared out from behind curtains of ivy, their glass filmed with grime and the accumulated sorrow of forgotten lives. A heavy, cloying scent of damp earth, stagnant air, and something else, something metallic, like old coins or forgotten blood, clung to the very fabric of the place. Inside, the silence was a living thing, thick and oppressive, broken only by the creak of my own footsteps on protesting floorboards. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the gloom, illuminating antique furniture draped in white sheets like slumbering giants. My initial exploration was methodical, a cartographer's survey of a new, unsettling terrain. Each room was a quadrant, each object a potential landmark in this uncharted domestic landscape. It was in the library, a vast chamber choked with moldering tomes, that I found it. Tucked away in a mahogany chest, beneath a pile of brittle ledgers detailing forgotten harvests and faded invoices, lay a rolled parchment. Its texture was unlike anything I had encountered in my professional life, thick, almost leathery, with the faint, musky perfume of antiquity. My fingers, usually so steady, trembled slightly as I unrolled it across the dusty surface of a writing desk. It was a map. But not just any map. This was a rendering of the estate, undoubtedly ancient, yet possessing a startling, almost impossible level of detail. My professional eye immediately recognized the masterful hand that had drawn the intricate contours of the land, the precise delineation of the coastline, the careful placement of every gnarled oak and crumbling stone wall. Yet, it was the anomalies that seized my breath, chilling the air around me. The known features of the estate were there, the main house, the stable block, the overgrown orchards. But beyond these, the map branched into a labyrinth of unfamiliar lines and symbols. A subterranean network, meticulously charted, snaked beneath the property, hinting at tunnels and chambers I had never imagined. There were strange, angular symbols, stark and unsettling, marking specific points, not property markers, nor geological notations, but something else entirely, glyphs that seemed to thrum with a silent, malevolent energy. And it was incomplete. It was as if the unknown had simply swallowed the known. Later, the moon, a sliver of polished bone, hung high above the ocean, casting a silver sheen across the water. I stood at the edge of the property, where the overgrown lawn surrendered to a narrow strip of sand. The air was heavy with the briny tang of salt and decay, the subtle scent of kelp and cold stone. Before me, the vast expanse of the ocean shore at night with stationary waves stretched into an inky blackness. The waves, usually a restless symphony of roar and spray, were hushed tonight, their surface an unnaturally still, flat expanse, reflecting the moonlight with an eerie, unblinking gaze. It was as if the ocean itself held its breath, waiting. I clutched the ancient map, its heavy parchment of foreign weight in my hand. My cartographer's curiosity, usually a pure, intellectual pursuit, was now tainted with a profound unease. Now, the inherited map lay before me, its faded inks and cryptic symbols a stark challenge to everything I understood. It was incomplete, yes, but its lines pulsed with an unsettling authority, demanding verification. My first foray into the estate was methodical, a cartographer's pilgrimage. GPS device clutched in one hand, the antique map in the other, I moved with the precision of a surveyor, tracing the boundary lines, charting the obvious features, the crumbling carriage house, the skeletal remains of a forgotten greenhouse, the meandering path to the overgrown gardens. The air, heavy with the scent of damp earth and briny sea, clung to me like a shroud. Twisted oaks, their bark like ancient, scarred skin, clawed at a sky the color of bruised plums. Every rustle of dry leaves underfoot felt like a hushed conversation I wasn't meant to overhear. It began subtly, a slight deviation. The old map indicated a narrow, stone-lined path leading away from the main house, curving towards what it vaguely labeled the Watchman's Rise. On the modern deeds, no such feature existed. My boots, however, soon found the faint indentations of what must have once been that very path, now swallowed by a riot of thorny brambles and tenacious ivy. It was a phantom limb of the landscape, a path erased from official record but stubbornly present in the soil. Clearing a small section, I found the rough-hewn stones, slick with moss, undeniable evidence of an overgrown structure not on modern deeds. A shiver, not entirely from the cool air, traced a path down my spine. Further on, as the afternoon light began to wane, the shadows deepened with an unnatural swiftness. They seemed to possess a weight, a density that absorbed rather than merely reflected light. Beneath a stand of pines, their needles forming a thick, suffocating carpet, the gloom was absolute, even in the filtering rays of the setting sun. My flashlight beam, usually so assertive, seemed to falter, its light swallowed by the profound, inky blackness that clung to the crevices of the earth and the undersides of gnarled roots. It was as if the very ground breathed in the light, hoarding it. It led me deeper, away from the familiar, towards a part of the estate the locals seemed to avoid, speaking of it only in hushed tones, if at all. My internal thermometer, usually so reliable, registered the anomaly, a stark, unsettling contrast to the surrounding air. Then I saw them, the stone markers. Not the neat, survey stakes of a modern property line, but squat, weathered monoliths, barely waist-high, their surfaces rough with lichen and time. There were 3 of them, forming a rough, illogical triangle. They bore no obvious carvings, no initials or dates. Yet, their placement was too deliberate to be accidental. They didn't align with any known purpose, not a boundary, not a memorial, not a guidepost. They simply were silent sentinels whose meaning was lost to time, or perhaps, deliberately obscured. My cartographer's instinct, trained to find order in chaos, found only a deeper, more unsettling enigma. As twilight bled into a moonless night, the distant drone of the ocean grew louder, a relentless, rhythmic pulse. The map, with its strange, looping lines, pulled me towards the sound. The peculiar sound started then, faint at first, barely perceptible over the crashing waves. A low, resonant hum, like a forgotten chord struck deep within the earth. It wasn't the wind, nor the groan of old timber. It was a sustained, vibrating presence, a sound that seemed to resonate in the marrow of my bones rather than my ears. Finally, the trees thinned, giving way to a stretch of coarse sand and shingle. The sea, usually a tempest of motion, was eerily still. The waves, instead of breaking and receding, held their form, like sculptures carved from obsidian and moonlight. The hum intensified here, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic scrape that seemed to come from beneath the sand itself. My eyes, straining in the gloom, followed the line of the stationary waves. There, at the precise point where the water's unnatural stillness met the land, another stone marker stood, larger than the others, its surface catching the faint starlight with a dull, obsidian gleam. It was deeply embedded in the earth, half submerged in the damp sand. And on its weathered face, barely visible beneath centuries of erosion, I discerned a faint, intricate pattern. The revelation struck me with the force of a physical blow. They were pieces of a larger design, a terrifying, deliberate arrangement etched onto the very landscape, a pattern that spoke of something ancient, something waiting. But the estate, with its sprawling, silent rooms and the enigma of the incomplete map, had begun to unravel the delicate piece. I sat hunched over the drafting table, the lamplight casting a tight circle on the parchment, the rest of the study dissolving into the encroaching gloom. The map, my project, my obsession, had become a lens through which the house itself seemed to focus its strange energy. I'd spent hours, days, meticulously cross-referencing the faded lines with my own surveys of the grounds. The incongruities were minor at first, a misplaced copse of trees, a path that no longer existed. But then came the subtler discrepancies, the ones that tugged at the frayed edges of my logic. A flicker, a momentary shadow in my peripheral vision, pulled my gaze from the intricate inkwork. Nothing. Just the old house settling, I told myself, a trick of the straining lamplight against the heavy drapes. The ancient timbers groaned, a symphony of decay and endurance, and I resumed my work, my focus absolute. Yet, the sensation lingered, a faint impression of movement just beyond the sphere of my direct sight, like a modal dust mote, or perhaps a fleeting, formless presence. I'd blink, turn my head sharply, and find only the quiescent air, the undisturbed motes dancing in the lamplight. My breath hitched, a tiny, involuntary catch in my throat. At first, I dismissed them as the creaks and groans of an ancient structure, the wind finding its way through unseen cracks. But as the nights deepened, the sounds took on a more distinct quality, a low, sibilant hum that seemed to resolve into indistinct, guttural syllables, just out of reach of comprehension. I would pause, pen hovering over vellum, straining to decipher the phantom conversation, only for it to dissolve back into the house's general acoustic tapestry the moment I focused. It was like trying to catch mist in a sieve. Was I hearing things? Perhaps my mind, starved for human interaction, was simply inventing company. Then, the objects. Not grand, dramatic shifts, but insidious, almost imperceptible rearrangements. I'd leave my favorite compass on the left side of my drafting table, only to find it later, nestled precisely in the center. A stack of survey notes, carefully weighted, would be found slightly askew, as if a gentle breath had stirred them. My initial reaction was always self-reproach, Reid, you're becoming forgetful. Or, you must have moved it subconsciously. But the precision of the changes, the deliberate nature of them, began to grate against my logical mind. A heavy brass paperweight, left squarely on a document, would appear an inch or two to the right. The nightmares were the worst, vivid and unsettling, painting the canvas of my sleep with images of the land beneath the estate. I felt the pressure of tons of earth, a crushing weight, and heard the faint, muffled cries that seemed to rise from deep within the ground. I walked until the salt spray kissed my face, until the very air hummed with the vast, indifferent power of the deep. But even there, at the edge of the world, I felt a faint, insistent tug, a sense of belonging to the earth behind me, to the secrets it held. Returning to the study, I found myself drawn back to the map, a moth to a flickering flame. The lamplight seemed weaker now, or perhaps my eyes were playing tricks. As I leaned closer, tracing a familiar contour, a new detail emerged. It wasn't a line I had drawn, nor was it present in the original, faded parchment. A faint, almost imperceptible symbol, like an ancient rune or a twisted root, had appeared just beneath the estate's main foundation. It was small, no larger than my thumbnail, but its presence was undeniable, etched with a precision that belied its sudden appearance. My breath caught. I ran a fingertip over the vellum, expecting the slick feel of fresh ink, but the surface was smooth, unblemished, as if the symbol had always been there, merely awaiting my perception. My rationalizations, once so comforting, crumbled like dry earth. They were deliberate. And the map, my anchor to logic and order, was no longer a passive historical document. It was a living thing, subtly, terrifyingly, changing. It was revealing itself, and with each new detail, it pulled me deeper into its ancient, malevolent embrace. The secrets of the estate were not merely buried beneath the land, they were rising, reaching for me. My hands, calloused by the sculptor's clay of cartography, now trembled not from exertion, but from a burgeoning, chilling understanding. The estate, this sprawling, decaying testament to a forgotten lineage, was not merely a canvas for my craft, it was a mausoleum of secrets, and I, Reid, was its unwitting archaeologist. My determination, once a steady flame, now flickered with a desperate, hungry light. I began my descent into the past not with a spade, but with a ledger. The library, a cavern of dust motes dancing in the shafts of fading light, became my new domain. Books, bound in leather so brittle it crumbled at the touch, spilled their musty breath into the air. I sifted through boxes labeled with elegant, spider-thin script, family papers, estate records, correspondence. The air grew thick with the scent of decaying paper and a faint, metallic tang I couldn't place. The earliest, dated nearly 2 centuries ago, belonged to a distant ancestor. His initial entries were mundane, detailing harvests and repairs. But then, a subtle shift. Scattered remarks about the odd behavior of the groundsman, unnatural stillness in the forest, and a persistent chill emanating from the eastern slope. I cross-referenced this slope with my map, tracing its faint, topographical undulations. A peculiar, circular depression, scarcely visible, was marked there. The journal keeper's prose grew fragmented, his hand less steady, his observations spiraling into paranoia. He detailed a growing weariness in the bones of the land itself, and an insidious pull that drains the very will. He drew crude, almost childlike sketches in the margins, twisted trees, a cavernous maw in the earth, all echoing the unique features I had so painstakingly mapped. Next, I unearthed a sheaf of letters, tied with a faded velvet ribbon. These were from a relative, writing from a distant city, to the journal keeper. The early letters were concerned, inquiring about his health. Later ones became increasingly alarmed, mentioning the family malady and the ancestral curse. One letter, its ink almost entirely faded, contained a stark warning: do not disturb what lies beneath the earth. It resonated with the anomalous depressions and the strangely regular, almost geometric, subterranean features my map alluded to. The folklore pieces came almost by accident, tucked into an old almanac. Scrawled notes in a hand different from the journals, perhaps a later occupant, detailed local superstitions. The land drinks, one note read. It takes a portion of all who dwell upon it. Another spoke of the turning of the earth, a cyclical event where the hungry ground awakens. These fragments, once dismissed as quaint rural eccentricities, now stitched themselves into a terrifying tapestry with the journal entries and letters. Disappearances weren't just isolated incidents, they were a pattern. The madness wasn't a family weakness, it was a symptom, a response to an encroaching, unseen force. I found myself pacing the floor of the library, the map unrolled beneath a flickering lantern, the journals and letters splayed around it. It was a witness. A grave marker. A warning. The map wasn't simply a guide to the estate, it was a key. My meticulous work, my pursuit of order, had led me not to clarity, but to a terrifying, formless entity that had consumed my ancestors, driving them to despair, then to oblivion. The estate wasn't just old, it was alive, and its life was one of slow, devouring hunger. It was a mirror to the ancient, unyielding power I had uncovered, a power that had always been here, beneath the soil, beneath the water, waiting. The stationary waves mocked my frantic discoveries, hinting at an eternal, relentless process. My breath hitched in my throat, a dry rasp against the salty air. The map in my mind, etched now with fear, glowed with an insidious, internal light. I held the key, and it felt less like power and more like a sentence. The contour lines, once my solace, now tightened around me, each etched curve a subtle, suffocating constriction. My hands, once steady and sure, trembled with a tremor that had nothing to do with the chill of the ancient stones and everything to do with a burgeoning, chilling understanding. But now, the veil between waking and nightmare thinned to gossamer. I saw them, even with my eyes wide open, even in the harsh glare of the oil lamp I kept burning through the endless night. Fleeting, spectral distortions in the periphery of my vision, a flicker of movement behind the dusty velvet curtains, a shadow that seemed to detach itself from the corner of a room, only to dissipate when I turned my head fully. They slithered from the walls, from the very air, coiling around my mind like serpents of sound. He watches, a voice, dry as parchment, rasped from the empty fireplace. The lineage remembers. Another, deeper, seemed to rise from the floorboards beneath my feet, resonating with a guttural hunger. The debt is due. It demands the sacrifice. The words were a brand upon my soul, searing away any remaining doubt. This was not a figment of exhaustion, this was a direct, malevolent address. The physical manifestations followed, undeniable and aggressive. A heavy tome on cartographic history, resting on the desk, slid with a deliberate scrape across the polished wood, stopping precisely at the edge, its spine facing me, revealing a faded illustration of an ancient, gnarled tree. I heard the faint, rhythmic creak of floorboards in the empty room above me, a phantom tread that mimicked my own pace. One evening, as I hunched over the incomplete map, trying to decipher a particularly obscure set of symbols, the quill in my hand snapped with a sharp crack, the ink splattering across the vellum like drops of spilled ichor. It was a cruel, playful malice, designed to unnerve, to break. Desperate, I reached for the telephone, the old rotary dial a relic in my trembling grasp. I needed to speak to someone, anyone, to articulate the horror pressing in on me. I tried my colleague, a fellow cartographer who shared my passion for historical anomalies. The line connected, and I heard the familiar ring, but before he could answer, the static erupted, a deafening hiss that clawed at my ears. They hissed. Bound by blood. I slammed the receiver down, my heart hammering against my ribs, the sound of its impact echoing in the sudden. The estate became a tomb, its walls pressing in, the air thick with unseen eyes. The waves, usually a restless symphony of crash and retreat, were unnaturally still. It was a sight that defied all natural law, a vast, silent mockery of the ocean's ceaseless churn. The air was heavy, devoid of the usual salty tang, replaced by a faint, cloying scent I could not place. Something metallic, something ancient, like disturbed earth. The stationary waves loomed, towering and silent, reflecting the moon's sliver in 1,000 unblinking eyes. And then, in the glassy surface of the largest, closest wave, I saw it. Not my reflection, but a shifting, indistinct form deep within the water, something vast and dark, like a shadow of the earth itself, stirring beneath the petrified surface. It pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence, and for a terrifying moment, I felt its immense, patient gaze fix upon me. The land, the very elements, had turned against me, becoming conduits for a malevolence that had woken, and now, demanded its due. I was utterly alone, a single, fragile consciousness trapped between a demanding past and a terrifying, inescapable present. There was no ebb, no flow, just a glassy, silent surface that seemed to breathe with a terrifying, unnatural slowness. The air, thick with salt and the cold breath of the deep, pressed against my skin, chilling me to the bone. Every muscle in my body screamed for flight, for escape, but the very ground beneath my feet felt tethered, an extension of the suffocating estate that had become my prison. It had seeped into the soil, into the stone, into the lineage that bound me to this decaying inheritance. To run was futile, the tendrils of its awakening stretched further than any horizon, reaching even into the still heart of the sea. I was a fly caught in amber, preserved in a moment of escalating horror, utterly alone. If escape was an illusion, then confrontation was the only truth. The map. It was the key, the labyrinthine blueprint of my undoing, or perhaps, my salvation. With a resolve born of utter despair, I turned my back on the unnerving stillness of the ocean, the stationary waves a silent judgment, and began the long, arduous trek back to the looming silhouette of the estate. Each step was a defiance, a forced march into the very maw of my fears. Its windows were like vacant eyes, staring out at a world it no longer understood, or perhaps, understood too well. The great oak door groaned in protest as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the cavernous hall, a lament for forgotten lives. The flickering gas lamp, left burning from my hasty departure, cast a sickly yellow glow over the parchment, illuminating the intricate lines and faded symbols that had consumed my waking hours. My hands trembled as I picked up the magnifying glass, my gaze falling upon the section I had last been studying, the confluence of lines beneath the estate's oldest, most overgrown section, where the earth seemed to sag and breathe with an unsettling heaviness. I had dismissed the strange symbols etched there as archaic cartographic shorthand, perhaps a surveyor's mark for an unusually deep well or a forgotten cellar. I pulled out the Ancestral ledger, a heavy tome bound in sun-faded leather, filled with the meticulous, spidery script of generations past. My great-grandfather, a man of profound intellect and unsettling reticence, had filled its margins with cryptic notes, observations that had always seemed tangential, almost poetic, until now. I flipped through the brittle pages, searching for a pattern, a recurring motif, anything that might align with the map's unsettling script. Then, my breath hitched. In the ledger, scrawled beside a diagram of a strange, interlocking series of concentric circles, were phrases that sent a shiver down my spine. A single, precise entry, the seal of the immemorial. My eyes darted back to the map. The lines were not paths. They were barriers. The strange symbols were not markers of a feature, but sigils of containment. The concentric circles on the map, which I had interpreted as a unique geological formation, were identical to the diagram in the ledger. This was no treasure map. It was a prison blueprint. The revelation struck me with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. The map depicted a vast, intricate seal, buried deep beneath the estate, holding something ancient, something unspeakably malevolent, in a state of perpetual stasis. The hidden features I had been so diligently trying to uncover were not rooms or tunnels, but the very components of this containment. My ancestors, these meticulous cartographers, had not merely charted the land, they had charted its cage. And it was weakening. The faint, almost imperceptible tremors that had begun weeks ago, the unsettling sounds that echoed from the ground, the very unrest of the land itself, these were not natural phenomena. They were the straining of the seal, the stirrings of the imprisoned entity beneath. The incomplete nature of the map, my own relentless drive to complete it, to verify its details, was a terrible, insidious trap. My lineage. My very bloodline. It wasn't coincidence that I, a historical cartographer, had inherited this place, this task. My ancestors had been the custodians of this terrible secret, perhaps even its architects. And now, the burden had fallen to me. I had been drawn here, not by chance, but by a deeper, more sinister design. Was I meant to be the one who completed the map, reinforcing the ancient seal, ensuring its continued slumber? Or was I, in my blind pursuit of cartographic perfection, merely the unwitting hand destined to unravel its final, fragile threads, to break the last barrier and unleash the horror upon the world? It was an ancient, earthbound hunger, shackled for millennia, and I, Reid, was the final, crucial piece in its long-awaited awakening. The stationary waves of the ocean had not been a judgment, but a prophecy. The map, once my passion, had become my torment, a terrifying instruction manual for either containment or cataclysm. And the choice, if it was even a choice, lay heavy and unbearable in my trembling hands. Not pathways, but the intricate weave of a cage. The realization had settled upon me like a shroud woven from ice and shadow, chilling me to the bone, yet stirring a frantic energy within. The entity, whatever it was, had not merely resided here, it had been imprisoned. And now, it stirred. Every creak of the old timbers, every sigh of the wind through the eaves, seemed amplified, imbued with a malevolent sentience. I could feel its gaze, a psychic weight pressing against my skull, urging me, pulling me. It beckoned, a silent siren song meant for the deepest, most vulnerable parts of my mind. I stumbled from the study, the heavy ledger clutched in a white-knuckled grip. The air in the hallway felt thick, suffocating, as if the very oxygen had been leached away by an unseen presence. My breath hitched, a desperate rasp in my throat. I had to get out. My feet, guided by an impulse not entirely my own, carried me through the darkened corridors, past the ancestors' portraits whose eyes seemed to follow my every move, their painted gazes holding centuries of complicity and dread. The front door groaned open, revealing a night sky bruised purple and black. The path twisted and turned, roots like gnarled claws grasping at my shoes. The familiar scent of pine and damp earth was now tinged with something else, a metallic tang, like old blood, and a deep, briny decay that clung to the air. The hum intensified, a low thrumming that resonated in my chest, making my ribs ache. My mind, usually a fortress of logic and order, felt porous, susceptible. Images flickered at the edge of my vision, the swirling patterns from the ledger, distorted faces, and a vast, gaping maw that swallowed starlight. Then, I emerged from the treeline. It was an impossible tableau. No foam, no roar, just an unnatural, profound stillness that defied all physics. The air was frigid, yet strangely heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and something indefinably old. I walked towards the water's edge, drawn by an invisible current. And then, it spoke. Not with a sound, but with a torrent of images and sensations that flooded my consciousness. It showed me glimpses of the land before the estate, before my ancestors, before time, when it had roamed freely. "You found the cage," a thought resonated in my mind, not a distinct voice, but a vast, echoing presence. "Now, unmake it." It was a lure, a temptation. All I had to do was cease my resistance, let go, allow its essence to mingle with mine, to become one with the boundless hunger that pulsed beneath the stationary waves. My knees buckled. A wave of nausea washed over me, my vision blurring at the edges. The immense pressure inside my head intensified, threatening to crack my skull. It sought to possess me, to use my hands, my knowledge, to complete its release. Its pages, which I had dismissed as mere historical curiosities, suddenly pulsed with a new meaning. The strange symbols, the complex geometry, the very intent behind them, snapped into focus. The concentric circles were not just a diagram of containment, they were a circuit, a ritualistic pattern designed to draw in and redirect the entity's own power against itself. It was not about simply maintaining the seal, but about reinforcing it, actively feeding the containment. The ledger described a specific sequence of actions, a ritual involving the very land itself, and a personal offering. It required an act of profound, deliberate unmapping, a sacrifice of the very order and understanding I held most dear. The method was clear, horrifyingly so. It demanded not just my will, but a piece of my essence, a deliberate dismantling of the mental frameworks that defined me. The entity thrived on chaos, on the dissolution of form. It would shatter my perception, perhaps forever. The stakes became brutally clear. If I failed, if I succumbed to its insidious lure, the entity would not merely reclaim the land. My ancestors had merely contained it. The choice was stark, my sanity, or the world. The whisper, a silken cord woven from my deepest fears and most fervent desires, still coiled in my mind. It had offered a cessation, an end to the gnawing uncertainty, the maddening dread. For a breath, a terrible, dizzying breath, I had almost succumbed. The thought of surrendering the burden, letting the tendrils of ancient malevolence simply take, was a siren song I felt in my bones. It was not my own. He had given in. And the estate, the land itself, had shuddered. I saw, with an awful clarity, what that surrender truly meant, not peace, but absorption. Not knowledge, but an emptying. The map, lying splayed on the oak table, seemed to pulse faintly in the lamplight. Its incomplete lines, once a source of frustration, now screamed their purpose. A ritual. A desperate, ancient binding. My hands, trembling not from fear but from a surge of grim resolve, traced the final, uninked symbols. There was no escape, no turning back. Only forward, into the maw. I gathered the items prescribed by the cryptic annotations on the map's margin, a silver dagger, its blade dulled by ages. Each object felt heavy, imbued with a purpose far older than my comprehension. Tonight, the air descending into it was thick, cloying, tasting of stagnant water and something else, something metallic and alive. I pushed aside the heavy wooden door, its hinges groaning like a dying beast, and descended into the blackness, the beam of my lantern a lonely spear against an encroaching tide. The steps, rough-hewn and slick with an unidentifiable slime, spiraled downwards. Then, it fractured. They spoke of my failings, my insignificance, the futility of my struggle. The air grew heavy, damp, tasting of salt and decay. My lantern beam wavered, then solidified, revealing a sudden, impossible vista. The moon, a grotesque, swollen eye, hung low, casting a sickly silver sheen over the water. But the waves, vast and towering, were frozen mid-crash, their white foam suspended, like colossal, petrified claws reaching for the sky. The sand beneath my feet was not sand, but countless fragments of shattered bone, crunching with a sickening resonance with each step. The air was still, utterly devoid of wind, yet the phantom scent of brine and rot filled my lungs. This was the entity's illusion, a twisted parody of peace, a promise of eternal stillness that was, in truth, eternal death. It sought to drown me in a false reality, to paralyze me with the horror of a world where natural laws had ceased to exist. Not real. Not real. When I opened my eyes, the shore was gone, replaced by the suffocating confines of the subterranean passage. The passage narrowed, the walls pressing in, alive with a pulsating, phosphorescent moss that cast an eerie, green glow. Roots, thick as my forearm, snaked through cracks in the stone, some twitching faintly as I passed, like sleeping serpents. Then came the physical obstacles. A section of the ceiling groaned, showering me with loose earth and small, sharp stones. I scrambled forward, my shoulders scraping against rough rock, the air thick with dust and the smell of disturbed soil. The passage floor became uneven, treacherous, as if the very ground sought to trip me, to swallow me whole. My skin crawled. Deeper still, the passage opened into a vast, echoing chamber, its ceiling lost in the gloom. And everywhere, etched into this bizarre substance, were symbols. Not the elegant, precise lines of my map, but crude, visceral carvings, distorted figures, gaping mouths, spirals that seemed to draw the eye into an infinite regress. Upon it, a shallow basin, perfectly circular, filled with a viscous, black liquid that did not reflect the light. Tools of a ritual, of a binding. And then I understood the true horror. The ritual was not to destroy it, but to feed it, to appease it with a specific, terrible offering, to bind it back into slumber. And the map. The map was not just a guide, but a set of instructions, passed down through my lineage, for the one who would ultimately perform this desperate act. The one who would make the sacrifice. My own lineage. My own blood. But I saw through them now. I saw the price. I stepped onto the dais, the silver dagger heavy in my hand. The basin of black liquid seemed to ripple, expectant. The phosphorescent moss pulsed, an eerie, green breath that painted the subterranean passage in an unholy glow. The air thickened, heavy with a scent like damp earth and ancient iron, pressing against my lungs until I gasped. Then, a sudden vacuum. A breath snatched, a violent disorientation that wrenched my very perception. The passage walls, the moss, the suffocating confines, all dissolved as if they had never been. The transition was not a shift but an instantaneous severing, leaving me bereft of the intervening seconds, the journey itself. Above, the moon, a blanched coin, hung in a sky bruised with a violet hue. Before me, the ocean stretched, an impossible tableau. Each crest, each foam-flecked lip, held perfectly still, like a photograph taken at the precise moment of collapse, yet never collapsing. The vast, murmuring voice of the sea was utterly silent, its power frozen into an inert, terrifying tableau. This was not merely calm, it was a cessation of natural law, a monumental quiet that hummed with immense, unspent energy. A cold seeped into my bones, not from the night air, but from within, a chill that promised to petrify my spirit. It was here. It was a weight that predated stone, a shadow older than light, and it coalesced from the unnatural stillness of the waves, from the depthless darkness between the static crests. I felt its gaze, a million pinpricks of profound indifference, assessing the fragile spark of my life. My hands, though trembling, found the worn leather of the map case. The parchment, brittle and fragile, unrolled to reveal the final, incomplete section of the estate, now illuminated by the impossible moonlight. The lines, once mere ink on paper, now seemed to throb with a faint, internal luminescence, mirroring the silent pressure that sought to crush me. This was it. The culmination of my cartographic obsession, the true purpose of the estate's hidden geometry, the design laid bare by generations of forgotten hands. The map was not merely a guide, it was a key, a set of instructions for a ritual long dormant. My fingers, numb but precise, traced the final intricate glyph onto the wet sand, a mirror of the forgotten sigil at the map's heart. You are but a fleeting tremor on the face of eternity. I ignored it, focusing on the meticulous geometry. The map's margins contained a series of precise coordinates, not for navigation, but for alignment, for drawing the unseen forces of the land into a specific configuration. I oriented myself, using the impossible moon as my guide, its light now feeling less like illumination and more like a drain on my vitality. I placed the small, heavy stones I had carried, each taken from a specific, marked location on the estate, at the points indicated by the map's hidden symbols. Each stone settled into the sand with a soft, resonant thud, like a heartbeat returning to a dead thing. The entity's resistance intensified. The stillness of the waves deepened, becoming an almost solid wall of pressure. My knees threatened to buckle. But the map, clutched in my hand, vibrated with a faint, insistent energy, a counterforce. It was more than paper, it was a conduit, a weapon forged from knowledge. I remembered the meticulous lines, the forgotten boundaries, the true purpose of the estate's sprawling design, not for human habitation, but for containment. The entity was not merely under the land itself, as depicted on the map, was its prison. My task was to reforge the ancient chains, to redraw the forgotten wards. With a final, guttural cry that tore at my throat, I completed the last line of the sandglyph, connecting the final stone. The pressure lifted. The impossible quiet remained for a breath, then, with a sound like the world drawing its first full breath, the stationary waves began to move. A distant murmur, then a gentle lapping, returned to the shore. The moon, still a blanched coin, now cast a softer, more natural light. I stood, swaying, a tremor running through every cell of my body. The lines, once so clear, now shimmered, indistinct. I was whole, yet terribly fractured. The victory was mine, yes, but the cost. The cost was etched onto my very soul, a brand of irreparable loss. The world felt subtly wrong, forever altered, and I, the cartographer of the known, was now navigating a landscape within myself that had no discernible boundaries. The silence was the first thing. Not the gentle hush of a sleeping world, but a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from the screams that had never quite left my throat, a profound absence where an overwhelming presence had been. The impossible moon, which had been my guide, my tormentor, was gone. Replaced by an indifferent, familiar sliver of silver, too pale, too distant to offer comfort, it cast a weak, tremulous light across a landscape I barely recognized. My body was a landscape of pain. I did not remember moving, only the agonizing, slow drift from the estate's ruined heart to this desolate expanse. My clothes, what remained of them, were stiff with dried earth and something else, something gritty and dark, clinging to my skin like a second, grotesque hide. The air here tasted of salt and absence. The waves, though present, were frozen in their approach, a paradox of motion and stillness, their crests like polished obsidian under the true moon's faint glow. They did not crash, did not roar. They simply were, a silent, unwavering presence, mirroring the stasis within me, the profound, unmoving quiet that had settled in my core. The sand beneath my bare feet was cold, each grain a tiny needle against raw, abraded flesh. My hands, I noticed, were stained with a deep, impossible red, not blood, but something mineral, something from the deep earth, something that would not wash away. My left arm hung useless, a broken marionette limb, its skin taut and bruised with the ghost of impossible pressures. My right cheek, where the final surge of power had lashed out, felt like fire and ice simultaneously, a grotesque mask of scar tissue already forming, a permanent brand against my jawline. I touched it tentatively, the skin erased, tender ridge alien beneath my trembling fingertips. Each breath was a shallow, painful negotiation with ribs that felt splintered, a lung that felt bruised, a body that felt utterly violated. The entity was gone. I knew this with an absolute certainty that transcended thought, a knowledge etched into the very marrow of my bones. Fragments of its hunger, its ancient, consuming desire, still whispered at the edges of my perception, like phantom limbs of a terrible dream. I felt different. Not just broken, but altered, as if my very essence had been reshaped, infused with a shard of the thing I had fought. I looked back, though the distance was too great to discern details, towards where the estate lay. I remembered the upheaval, the ground tearing itself apart, the very stones groaning as the earth regurgitated its ancient secret. The land, once merely overgrown, would now bear scars that no cartographer could ever fully map, wounds that would bleed into eternity, unseen by the casual eye, but felt by the very earth itself. The thought of the world beyond this desolate shore, beyond the ruined estate, was a strange, distant thing. The detective, the colleagues, the casual acquaintances, they would go about their lives, oblivious to the chasm I had stared into, the price I had paid. My disappearance, or my return, would be met with questions I could never answer, with pity I could never accept. How could I explain the impossible geometry, the living earth, the moon that defied its own nature, the sacrifice that had been demanded and given? The entity was gone, yes, but I was not whole. I carried it, perhaps, in the way a pearl carries an irritant, a constant, dull ache that was also a source of strange, unsettling insight. The world, through these new, unwilling eyes, seemed thinner, more translucent. I saw the hidden currents beneath the surface, the faint, shimmering lines of power that crisscrossed the land, the subtle hum of ancient forces. It was a terrible gift, a curse that ensured I would never truly be free, even in victory. The silence was the first thing. Reprieved. That was the word that whispered through the desolate chambers of my mind, thin and brittle as old parchment. Reprieved, but from what? And at what cost? My body felt like an empty vessel, scoured clean by a storm of unknown origin. Every nerve ending hummed with a phantom echo, a memory of pressure and release that left my limbs heavy, my breath shallow. I walked away from that cursed ground, though how far or for how long, I could not say. The journey was a blurred tapestry of gray light and aching footsteps, a winding path taken by instinct rather than conscious thought. I found myself, eventually, at the edge of the world. The air tasted of salt and something metallic, a tang that scraped against the back of my throat. Before me, the vast, inky expanse of the sea stretched to meet a horizon swallowed by an even deeper blackness. But the waves. They did not move. The sight was a profound violation, a physical manifestation of the impossible, and it mirrored the stillness within me. My own life, too, felt suspended, waiting for emotion that refused to come. The stationary waves were not just an anomaly, they were a monument to the moment I had shattered something fundamental. A price had been paid, an exchange made. I had sought to complete a map, to understand a lineage, and in doing so, I had become a part of the very thing I unearthed. Days bled into weeks. I tried to return to the life that had once been mine, the life of a meticulous historical cartographer. I dusted off my old drafting table, sharpened my pencils, and laid out pristine sheets of vellum. But the lines I drew were hesitant, the angles uncertain. I saw the world differently. The familiar contours of hills, the meandering paths of rivers, the precise grid of city streets, they all seemed thin, fragile veneers over something immense and ancient. My cartographer's eye, once attuned to the visible, now perceived the unseen, the fault lines of reality, the subtle undulations of an earth that breathed with a hidden, malevolent pulse. I had not defeated the entity, not truly. I had merely contained it, perhaps even appeased it. But the act of containment had irrevocably bound me to it. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, when the city slept and the only sound was the rustle of leaves outside my window, I felt a peculiar pull. It was an urge to check, to ensure the seal held, to stand vigil over the sleeping horror. My victory was not freedom, but a new form of servitude. I was tethered, a living anchor for the malevolent force I had disturbed. My hands, once so eager to draw the known world, now felt an insistent yearning to delve into the unknown, to map the unseen currents beneath the surface, not with ink and paper, but with an internal compass aligned to the buried entity. The horror was contained, yes, but it was never truly over. I was Reid, the cartographer, still.